Hello, and welcome back to the next episode of the Campbell County Trunk Show presented by Postmark LaFollette right here on WLAF. As always, I'm your host, Brad Smitty. Tonight is going to be episode 8 of 10 of the Promised Land series. Remember, if you missed any of our prior episodes, they're streaming online at postmarklafollette.org. Just click on Trunk Show, or you can go to the WLAF YouTube channel. Tonight we're going to talk again with Greg Miller. We've talked to him in previous episodes as well, but episodes 8 through 10 to finish out the Promised Land are going to be about where we're at now in Campbell County and where we're going into the future. And specifically, we're going to talk about what makes a community. You know, the point of the Trunk Show, and we'll talk about that over the next 3 episodes, is to get your feedback, to hear your input and have you tell why you love living in Campbell County. Tell about your family, your friends, and your history. That's why, as always, after my little talk here, you're going to have the information that you can call us, email us, or connect with us on social media and tell your stories just the way that Greg and I will tonight. Because ultimately, the future of Campbell County is in our hands. And that's what the Trunk Show is all about. It is a show for Campbell Countyans, by Campbell Countyans, and it's meant to hear your voice. So, tonight, we're going to spend a lot of time talking with Greg Miller, and it's really going to be focused on a one-on-one interview with him. The reason being, one of the things that we'll talk about over the next 3 episodes is the need to have conversations with people, just like sitting down on the front porch, like many of us still do or grew up doing. So, really take the time to sit with us tonight and listen to what Greg has to say and see if it reminds you maybe of growing up in this area. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Greg, and we're going to share that interview with you now, as well as the information of how you can reach out to us. All right, we're back for one more interview with Greg Miller here on the Campbell County Trunk Show. And as we kind of wrap up the Promised Land series in our last 3 episodes, I wanted to get with Greg and kind of talk about a few different things. But I got to know Greg, I guess it was a little bit over a year ago before we did our Smithsonian Stories Yes program. And he came down and was interviewed by some young adults at Postmark LaFollette for the Smithsonian project, where they made their own documentary. And I got to know Greg because, we're both locals. I come from the Stinking Creek community, and he's out in the Coolidge area originally. And he shared in some of his interviews previously where his families came from. But the thing about the Trunk Show is, and I was telling Greg before I started this, there's a lot that you could say about it, but really the core of it is talking to people, getting to know their story, where they came from. And if you watch each one of our episodes, I'm always telling you to submit your stories, contact us, tell us about your family. And we're going to keep trying to build that. And so, as part of the 10-part Promised Land series, we've talked with Greg about why people originally came to Campbell County. Why some of his family went north, why some of them came back, why he's here. We've talked to others about their same stories doing these different things. But as we kind of end this series and we think about what is Campbell County now, where is Campbell County going? Each one of us are going to have our own thoughts, our own visions. And once again, this is the type of television show where we're seeking that, from you and your input. But, for these last 3 episodes, because Greg's been a wealth of knowledge and also just someone I enjoy speaking with, I thought if the point of this show is to kind of be a front porch conversation and talking with people, what better way to do that than just to sit down with Greg one more time and chat about a few things. And so, Greg, like I say, these last 3 episodes, we're looking at what Campbell County is now. where we think it's going, and what is Campbell County in terms of the different communities. And I'd like to start there. So I'll start with myself, and then I'll turn it over to you, Greg, and we'll just kind of have an open conversation, really, with no format here. But originally, I grew up in the Stinking Creek community, so part of the mountainside of Campbell County. Often when you talk to people, there's kind of this divide, with the ridge. There's those of us over the mountain, and then there's those that are in the valley. And especially if you get up into like White Oak and Elk Valley, you'll kind of see that more, in terms of the two different sections. And so I've always been curious about that. And then from talking with you, Greg, and in prior episodes, you talked about, good-natured teasing, like even if you were to date someone outside of the Coolidge community. Here, we've got Jellicoe, LaFollette, Jacksboro. We think of those, but you've also got Fincastle, you got Well Springs, you've got Coolidge, you got White Oak, you got all these different places, that make up Campbell County. And we've kind of explored some of their history in the past. So I don't know, I guess what I would ask you, Greg, and we've kind of talked about this before, but what are some of the things, living here with all these different communities, and there being the mountain section, the valley section, what are some of the things that have always fascinated you, just kind of about the different communities here, and just how people kind of identify with where they're from, even though it's all Campbell County?
Well, I think in part it's the fact that there is a difference from one community to the other, but the differences are subtle, and there's a unity. People are from Campbell County, and there's a commonality that we all share. And you can sit down and talk to anybody from anywhere in Campbell County, and you understand what they're talking about. You understand the things that are important to them. And yet there are those subtle differences. It works county to county, but also community to community. My father was raised in the Coolidge community, and at one time I was probably related to half the people in Coolidge. They were a big family, and families intermarried. And I guess part of the question is, what makes a community in the first place? Why do some places seem to become a community and others perhaps less so? In the old days, our society, the way it was structured, encouraged community. You had local schools, which were a focal point for the children of an area, and almost every community in the county back in the old days, however far back that is, at least my childhood and beyond, there was a local school, at least an elementary school, and sometimes all the way up to high school. And so the families coalesced around a school. Typically, there was a primary church that most everybody in the community attended. So there was a commonality there. In the rural communities, they coalesced around agriculture. So if somebody got hurt, all the men and women in the community pitched in. They would harvest their crops for them, put them up, or plow and sow their crops. If there was a widow in the area, the men took turns and cut firewood for them and did repairs around the house and milked their cows and just kind of pitched in and did whatever they could. And to me, community is extended family. You have a sense of family with your neighbors, with the people that you know. I grew up in LaFollette in the Linden Park subdivision, and I have a sense that Linden Park as a subdivision wasn't much different from any other subdivision in the area, at least in town. As I called them, my country cousins referred to me as a townie because I was in town, but the difference was like 10 miles down the road, but it was a different cultural setting, I guess, to some extent. But I grew up in a subdivision where everybody knew everybody, and we had in a sense, a local school. Kids from Linden Park went to West LaFollette School, back in those days, elementary school, and we walked to school. You actually walked to the junior high as well, but I went to school with the same kids that I grew up around. The church I went to was the same church most everybody went to from our little community. We even had a grocery store in our little subdivision, and that was sort of like our rec center. Everybody went there, and they didn't just buy groceries. They stopped, they talked, they chatted. Your neighbors came and went, and that was sort of the meeting place. Buying groceries was secondary. You just stayed there for a while and visited with everyone. You know, and it was just a small store, but it meant so much to the neighborhood. So, you know, we had an insular sense of community. I did, you know, growing up, you just played in the whole neighborhood, and whatever yards you were in at lunchtime, they'd drag you in and feed you. And if you were there at supper time, they'd, you know, call your parents and say they're over here, but they'd throw you in the tub if you were dirty and scrub you up. And if you know, and then feed you supper, and you'd sit there with that family and eat. If you didn't like what they had, you'd go home. But if, you know, but it was just, you felt safe, and you felt like everybody was your neighbor. You knew everyone. You know, nowadays, it's a concern for me that a lot of children are growing up and they don't have that sense of community. You know, I live in a wonderful neighborhood, but I know a couple of my neighbors a little bit, and that's from past associations. But as far as the people in the neighborhood, I just know them to wave at them. You know, I haven't been in their house. I've got one neighbor I occasionally chat with if we're walking our dogs at the same time, but I don't really know anything about them much, you know, and it's not anything like when I grew up. You know, when I was a kid, everybody hung their clothes out on a clothesline, you know, and it just shows how technology can impact the creation of community and community sense. Everybody hung their clothes up on a clothesline when I was a kid. Well, the women in the neighborhood all hung their clothes out about the same time. I remember my mom hanging clothes up when the neighbor lady would hang hers up, and they would chat, and they would be on either side of a fence, and they would chat with one another and catch up. And if you had a sudden need, if you had to take a child to the doctor and you had another child in school, you just called one of the neighbors, and they would pitch in, or they'd feed the kids, or they would pick them up from school if you had an issue. And everybody just was there and helped. Now, you know, it seems like everybody's distance, everybody's isolated. You know, nobody hangs their clothes out on the line anymore. And if you see your neighbor, you might wave, but, you know, it's rare that you know them well. When I grew up in Linden Park, we knew everybody. I could walk around the neighborhood and tell you everybody there and what they did and who they were, partly because I saw them all the time at our little grocery store, you know, and you knew them. And the town was like that. If I went to LaFollette as a kid, if I went into a store, I knew everybody. You know, I'd go to, you know, I thought Powell's Five and Dime was the most wonderful place on earth back in that day. But I knew the people that worked there. If you went to a restaurant, and LaFollette had, I don't know how many, a dozen or more good restaurants back in that time, I knew everybody there. My parents knew them. A lot of them I either went to church with or saw them on a regular basis. If we went to the department store, like Bayloff's department store, I knew all the people that worked there. You know, of course, I was a child, but they would make over me and tease me and so forth. But people tended to stay in the same place and work there for years at a time. Every place just about had a lunch counter, from the bus station to the drug stores, you know, and then there were the formal restaurants, but you knew the people, you saw them year after year after year.
All right, we're going to take a short break here in the interview just to take a moment to pause and really have you think about what are some of the things that Greg and I have talked about that you remember growing up in this area? Or if you're new to this area, maybe are these some of the things that you've noticed about the locals here now that you're becoming part of the community?
So think about that, and think about the conversations that you could have with people, the conversations you have had with people, and what your experiences in Campbell County have been. But also think about how this is just the story of two of us and how you could share your stories with us. But also think, how do you want to see this area going forward? What role are you going to play in that? And how can you affect the changes that are coming? So when you're hearing this conversation between myself and Greg's talking or I'm talking, apply it to yourself. Think about how your experiences are similar, no matter if you grew up here or you came here. And think about how you can share your experiences with others to affect the community that you're in now and share your experiences so that we all learn together. So without further ado, once again, I'm going to turn it back over to the second part of our interview tonight with Greg, and let's go ahead and move it over that way right now.
And so there was a sense of community. So growing up, I never felt like I went anywhere where I was a stranger. From downtown to anywhere in the neighborhood, even the nearby neighborhoods, I went to school with those kids, so I knew them, you know, and a lot of them I went to church with too. So there was just this constant sense of community, and it has an influence, particularly on children. For one thing, you have a sense that you can't get away with anything, which was largely true. Yeah, everywhere I went, somebody was watching me. I didn't know it. My mom used to let me walk to the grocery store, and it was on the other side of a hill. And I thought, you know, I don't think Lewis and Clark felt more independent than I was when I was going to the store by myself. You know, I felt 10 feet tall and bulletproof, and I was on a big adventure and all this. I didn't know till years later, but my mother watched me all the way to the top of the hill, and then she would call ahead. And the store was owned by a wonderful man named Bill Shannett, and she would call Mr. Shannett, and he would come outside the store and stand and watch for me when I came over the hill, and he watched me all the way to the store. I had no idea, of course, and he would watch me on the way back, and that was just the way it was. You know, and sometimes it crosses my mind, what do kids growing up today have as a sense of community? And I wonder, you know, do you have warm, fuzzy memories about going to Walmart? You know, not that there's anything wrong with Walmart. It's a great store, but I go to Walmart and I don't know anybody that works there. You know, it's just kind of a big industrial, you know, merchandising machine. And I go in and shop, and occasionally I bump into somebody I know, but it isn't like the places that I remember growing up as a child. There was a restaurant in downtown LaFollette. As I said, there were a lot of good ones, but the business people tended to go to one or two of them for the most part. And one of them had a big round table in the back, and they called it the round table. And it would seat, I guess, 12 or 14 people. And that was for the business people, the leaders of the community, politicians and so on. And you had to be invited to eat lunch at the table. And it was a big deal when they invited you to sit at the round table and have lunch there. And so people would do that. And I remember, you know, as a kid eating in that restaurant and seeing the round table. It was in the back of the room from the street all the way back. And you'd see those people come and go, and they would sit, and they all knew one another. So you had a community of business leaders and a community of you know, the mayors and the city councilmen and people like that. My dad was a circuit court clerk, and he would frequently go there and eat lunch and visit with people. The judges would go there and eat and so on. But that enforced a sense of community. You know, so everywhere you went, there were things that tied you to the people in your area. And that was true regardless of the community. You know, in school, I met kids from everywhere. You know, there'd be White Oak or whatever, and there was mountain people and valley people, although it didn't make much distinction. Even in the valley, you know, there was down the valley and up the valley. So, you know, and I had relatives up the valley and down the valley too. But, in the rural areas like Coolidge, they had these little traditions. There was a friendly rivalry between that and nearby areas. But in the town, it was like everybody was part of that community. And I think Jacksboro was the same way, and Caryville, and Fincastle, of course, Well Springs. In fact, back during the Civil War, Fincastle was one of the primary communities in the county. They had important meetings up there. There were civic leaders that were from the Fincastle area. And it was, of course, LaFollette didn't exist, say, at the time of the Civil War. But if you were living in Campbell County in 1860, you would have thought Fincastle was one of the major areas of the county. Jacksboro was quite small, and so was Caryville. Fincastle was one of the primary focal points of community and leadership. Today it's a beautiful area. A lot of fine people live there, but you might not have that sense if you just came to Campbell County today because it's smaller. But it was very important in Campbell County's past. And today you might hear people talk about lake people, versus town people or whatever. But those senses of community that I had growing up have changed. Schools have been consolidated. They've done away with the neighborhood schools. Even neighborhood churches, in some places. The rural communities, not so much. But in areas like town, you might have a church, but people may go there that lives 20 miles away, and they go there, and other people may go other places or not at all. And so, I look and I see, to me, it's like a fabric that the strings are slowly fraying apart on with this concept of community. And people seem to move a great deal more than they used to. My parents lived in Linden Park. They moved, but they moved from one part of Linden Park to another, but they lived there, I guess over 60 years in that same neighborhood. So now, people live somewhere 2 or 3 years, somewhere else 2 or 3 years, here or there. And you kind of wonder, at least I do, if you have a lot of people that don't have a sense of community, then what effect does that have on people, on their attitudes about society? Do they really care about an area all that much? Are they looking more for services or what the area can do for them, as opposed to what they can do for the area or the community? And a lot of places, I think, no longer have that sense of community. For one thing, people move in, they didn't grow up there. There's a lot of new families in Coolidge, for instance, and you have to wonder, how invested are they in that community if they didn't grow up there? They don't have relatives there. They just move in, and maybe they do, maybe they don't. I remember my dad talking when he was a kid. They didn't have electricity. This was before TVA. And one of the neighbors had a radio. Well, nobody had electricity. So at certain times when there would be a big game on the radio or a boxing match or something everybody wanted to listen to, they'd go to this person's house and they'd bring a car battery, and they'd hook the radio up to a car battery, and everybody would sit and listen to the radio. And my dad said he didn't know there was a Great Depression until he read about it in a book years later, because he lived on a farm. They had plenty to eat and not much else, but they never went hungry. But that was just what you did. You brought a car battery, and everybody in the area gathered around this radio, and they all sat there and listened, and that brought people together. Today it seems like you have to have a disaster to bring people together. If there's a flood or something, everybody kind of pulls together, but then as soon as everything's normal, they kind of go their own way. And so there's no doubt that change, I think, in our sense of community is very important from a societal standpoint. I don't know what effect it's had, if any, but I can't help but believe that it's had some impact, on our society as a whole. But growing up, I had a sense of community everywhere I went. I was from Linden Park, but in the subdivisions, it didn't matter too much. Indian River Village was just down the road. I knew every kid in Indian River Village, and there was no rivalry there. I could have walked to Indian River Village and not been rocked like my dad. If he'd courted outside of Coolidge, he'd have got rocked on the way back home. But we didn't do that kind of thing, and I think partly because we went to the same school, the same church. So, it more like, well, you just live down the road a piece, but we had that sense of a bond there. A lot of us went back then. You didn't have kindergarten in public school, and there was a private kindergarten in Linden Park. And so a lot of the people that became my lifelong friends, we all went to kindergarten together at this little private school run by one of the neighbors. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And of course, we walked there, and there was about 30 of us, and we all became friends. Most of us went to the same church, and we all went to the same school when we got out of kindergarten. So, and we eat at the same restaurants and saw each other. And, of course, my dad was a politician. He couldn't go anywhere without talking for 30 minutes or an hour. If he went to the store for a loaf of bread, it'd take him 2 hours to get back home because he spoke to everybody in the store and he knew everybody. Had a wonderful facility for remembering names. I wish I did, but he could meet somebody one time, 30 years later, he'd know their name and he'd remember their genealogy and their lineage and how they were related to everybody else. Unfortunately, I don't have that knack. If I meet somebody 15 minutes later, I'm lucky to remember their name, but he did. And that was just part of it. He never met a stranger. And truthfully, growing up, I didn't either. There were no strangers. If they didn't know me, they knew my parents, and you all had friends in common and relatives in common and people in common and places in common. And that, I think, was true for all of Campbell County, and I guess at least every rural community in the country. That's just the way it was.
All right, folks. That's going to do it for tonight's episode. We hope you enjoyed your time with Mr. Miller. Once again, we want to encourage you to think about how you've had similar conversations with people and how this talk applies to your own life. We, once again, want to hear from you, and we're going to put up the information of how you can contact us here in just a moment, by phone, by email, by social media. Now remember, we have 2 more episodes of the Promised Land series of the Trunk Show. The next episode is going to be on Wednesday, June 9th, 8:30 p.m., right here on WLAF. And the final episode of the Promised Land is going to be Wednesday, June 26th at 8:30 p.m., right here on WLAF. And it's important to remember that's just for this series of the Promised Land series. We plan to have many more episodes of the Trunk Show featuring you, the people of Campbell County. So this isn't the end, it's just the end of this series. So once again, we're going to really feature talking with Greg Miller over those next episodes as we continue to focus on community and continue to focus on where Campbell County is going. And we hope that as you watch those, that you're thinking the same and you share your stories with us about exactly that as we go forward. So until next time, I'm your host, Brad Smitty. Thank you so much for the support of this program. We'll see you in a couple weeks on June 9th at 8:30 p.m. Thank you.